Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be, and welcome to this session in day 2 of the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. Our theme today is decommodify, and it is a privilege to chair the session entitled Accessing the Labor Market, the Power and Limits of Commodifying Labor. My name is Adelle Blackett. I'm a professor and Canada Research Chairholder at McGill University, and I'm delighted to be able to chair this session. We have 3 leading specialists from different disciplines who will be addressing us today on a theme that has been central, really, to the work of key international organizations. The International Labour Organization, of course, in its quest to provide social justice and the meaning that it's been giving to the notion of decent work. The United Nations more generally, and I'll just reference Article 23 because that was referenced in the manifesto of 2020. That's at the center of this global movement, and that emphasize the right to work, to free choice, employment, just and favorable conditions of work, protection against unemployment, as well as non-discrimination, just and favorable remuneration, equal pay for equal work, and the right to join trade unions. So what does it mean to access the labor market? What is the power? What are the limits of commodifying work? Our first speaker will be Dr. Renata Queiroz Dutra, who is an adjunct professor of labor law and procedure at the Faculty of Law of the University of Brasilia. She holds a doctorate in law, state, and constitution from the University of Brasilia, and she's a member of the Work, Transformations, Democracy, and Social Protection Research Group, as well as a number of other research institutions with themes deeply connected to this topic, including precariousness and resistance at the Faculty of Philosophy and Human Sciences of UFBA. So she will speak first. Our second speaker is Professor Virginia Mantouvalou, who is Professor of Human Rights and Labor Law in the Faculty of Laws of the University College London. She is widely published and widely read on human rights and labor law, and her research appears in leading journals, including the Modern Law Review, Journal of Law and Society, Theoretical Inquiries in Law, and her most recent co-edited book is on the philosophical foundations of labor law with Hugh Collins and Gillian Lester, that was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And her current monograph is on structural injustice, workers' rights, and human rights, funded by the British Academy. Our third speaker is Mr. Karel Vanderporten. He is currently a policy officer of social economy in the European Commission, the Directorate General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship, and Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. And his work focuses mainly on the following themes: the use of digitization and new technologies within the social economy, scaling up social business models, and the creation of business partnerships between traditional and social economy enterprises, financing opportunities for social economy companies, and social innovation. So it's a delight to have you each here. Each speaker has 10 minutes, after which we'll have an opportunity to open this up to questions from the audience. So first, Renata, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adelle. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss with you and to be part of this important international mobilization in favor of protected and meaningful work. I'd like to congratulate the women who had this powerful initiative constructing this event with women from all parts of the world. I'd like to thank Flávia Máximo, who connected us in Brazil to be part of this project. And I'm really glad to be here and have the opportunity to discuss with Professor Adelle Blackett, Professor Virginia Mantouvalou, and Professor Karel Vanderporten. I start apologizing myself for my English. I will really demand your patience in this morning, but I'd like to share some thoughts about the idea and the possibilities of the commodified paradigm of work in Brazil today. The manifest, subscribed by researchers from different parts of the world in 220, aims to recuperate an idea that at some point in history was considered as consolidated, at least from the political and juridical perspective, established normatively. The simple premise that labor isn't a commodity may have been one of the most beautiful utopias of labor law. To say in a society of merchandise that there are limits to what can be commercialized can seem like a contradiction and even be considered naive. But it has made possible the arrangement that has subsidized capitalism for some decades and from which it ungratefully today moves away from. Polanyi explained in 1944 that if it weren't by the limits established by counter-movements that resist to capital's tendency of converting everything into a commodity and by doing so degrades everything, the merchandise economies would be self-destructive. The regulatory limits, among which labor law is included, made possible a conciliatory survival rate to the capitalist system in historical moments of great challenge. Capitalism has assimilated from violent social eruptions that the radicalization of its premise in the humanizing legions of workers also led them to radicalize their contestations, producing great instabilities. To this matter, to affirm as a normative north that labor isn't a commodity and from there deduce a series of protective mechanisms for the hiring of work is to presume a political pact of limited character, especially because it maintains the basis of the productive model and with great difficulties of implementation as it goes against its natural tendency, but represented a spin in regards to the commitment to social issues that unfolded themselves in a political juridical ethos inseparable from the humanitarian affirmations that mark the end of the Second World War. The semantics of human rights, the reaction to fascism, and the risks of rupture of the social tissue engendered by them, as well as the recognition of the limits of juridical positivism, had their transit associated to this new arrangement of social issues, also in a humanizing and democratic perspective that is entitled by Alonso Pio, The Spirit of Philadelphia. The technology of labor law is a beautiful contradiction. While it conserves structures, it encourages expectations. While it legitimates the exploration through the work contract, it humanizes and politically readjusts each one of the exploited in the productive space and beyond it. This is the greatest creator of meaning and also the most vulnerable point of a protective juridical paradigm. While humanizing the workforce and politicizing the decisions related to it, labor law not only creates rules about wages and working journey, it creates deep meanings of the experience of work that opens itself to new and deeper claims and into earnings. This humanized and politicized experience of work, surrounded by juridical apparatus and protective institutions, due to the centrality of work to human experience, accumulates and models other social experience of community living, both in the political and communitarian senses. Living the labor law in the space-time of production is a contradictory experience, a subversive one, and above all, an uncomfortable one to the capitalist system. To deny it, on the other hand, is an option as degrading as dangerous, because it generates misery, injustice, dehumanization, raising the temperature of conflicts up until to eruption. Between the two options, even after the conquests and commitments of Philadelphia, and after the brief experience of diffusion of social state models in countries of Western North, capitalism in its neoliberal and financialized forms doesn't hesitate. Doubling the bets made and lost in the beginning of the last century, it recognized its mechanisms of accumulation so that labor, distributed and articulated between North and South, can be more and more precarious. This is done aiming that the model of an interventory state or social protection dwindle or end, and that under the illusionist idea of economic freedom, individuals could be sold in the market according to old laws of supply and demand, maybe cycling 12 hours a day with no employment relationship, maybe integrating the informal global chains of value, maybe experience fear and insecurity for their jobs more and more revolving, maybe facing misery in the context of illness or old age when the social security systems close its doors to them. While tearing up the ethos of Philadelphia, the new form of capitalism does so with the insolence of someone who reuses a past speech, ignoring its failure and the previous need to step back. But it also demonstrates its ideological power, as it does so by convincing the public opinion that this way of doing things is inevitable. This ethos that appeared some decades ago, not much susceptible to contestation, mainly by an open discursive confront, with the rise of neoliberalism starts being challenged, first illicitly, through practices that led to the repeated disrespect of labor law commands through artifice, scams, and frauds. Then, audaciously, by various labor reforms with the positivation as law of what before was considered anti-law or employer's transgression. The neoliberal project, while putting at stake labor and human life itself in subjective, social, and material dimensions, a scenario aggravated in the pandemic context, moves us to retrocede 6 decades to reaffirm the postulates of the Declaration of Philadelphia in defense of the political juridical paradigm centered in the non-commodification of human labor. However, our encounter with this paradigm, especially at the Global South, presupposes recognizing the fallibility of the same model and the need for adjustments that can direct us to more inclusive perspectives, always in the opposite direction of the neoliberal winds. This is because when conforming the political juridical paradigm of labor protectively regulated with universal aspiration, and as a result of the fights and historic experiences of industrial workers in Western Europe, the fact that the working class was not only male, not only white, not only industrial, and not only European has been ignored. And the generalization of a model based on this premise would be artificial and excluding for the majority of the workers across the world. This is why we need to think of women responsible for unpaid and not regulated work, caring for their families before and after their insertion public sphere. That's why we need to think about the legacy of slavery and the social construction of racism based on the non-absorption of the ex-slaves labor force in the formal labor market, with their consequent juridical exclusion and leading to informality, so significant in the Brazilian context. That's why we need the need of reconstructing the subject of labor laws, protected beyond the restrictions the colonized model enforced, and that loses meaning and relevant possibilities of construction in face of peculiarities of our national reality. For the matter, to decommodify labor in Brazil means to regulate protectively the work experience reminiscent from slavery, combating the ways it has unfolded until the present. Moving away from the neoliberal paradigm, it means to pertain to domestic workers the same rights, we are not there yet, to understand and assimilate in the regulatory paradigm how the old and the new informalities articulate themselves to the detriment of working individuals, to extend labor law beyond the employment, and align its semantics, above all, to the social policies of minimum income, essential in a context of inequalities and underdevelopment. The pandemic crisis potentialized inequalities and unveiled the fallibility of neoliberal regulatory dynamics, not only constituting the moment to refute the mercantile regency of life and work, but also to improve the non-commodified paradigms of work, surpassing the features of colonialism, of slavery, and consequently of racism and of patriarchalism in the Western model of social protection stated in Philadelphia. If we really want to decommodify work around the world, we should start recognizing the peculiarities of the nations from the South and understanding that the reconstruction of the protective paradigms need to look at labor conditions from the basis of the pyramid, Black women from the global South, and the many works they do that aren't even recognized as work. This seems to demand the reconstruction of the concept of work, of the structures and of the criteria of protection and of insertion on social systems in a really revolutionary way. It's time to imagine other possibilities of living and working in common. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry for the time.
Thank you very much, Renata, for really quite an eloquent articulation of the beautiful contradiction as you frame it, and for so carefully working through what it might look like to have an alternative paradigm. Very insightful. Our second speaker.
Thanks very much, Adele. Thank you, Renata, for the great talk. And I also wanted to thank very much the organizers for putting together this incredible conference with all of us from across the world. It's a real privilege to be part of it. So, yeah, the topic of our panel is accessing the labor market, and we have been asked to talk about the decommodification of labor, its power and limits. And as Renata said, this is the slogan of the ILO, labor is not a commodity, and this is well known. So it was great to see that this is one of the central principles in the manifesto on democratizing work. So I'll talk a bit about the UK, where I am based, where I work. What we see nowadays in the UK is that access to the labor market is becoming more difficult and more restrictive for certain categories of workers in very many ways, and it is worse than it was before. To be more precise, what concerns me is that there are concrete legal rules, laws that make certain categories of workers particularly vulnerable to exploitation. These are sometimes workers who work in jobs that were viewed as essential, all these essential workers during the pandemic, but many of these categories of workers have traditionally been undervalued. And we see how through laws that either pre-existed or have emerged now after the pandemic and after Brexit, they become more vulnerable to exploitation than before. I will give 3 examples to explain how this has happened through UK law, and it's not unique in the UK but the UK is sometimes say worse, let's say, than other countries on that front, as you will hear. And these ways are emerging and crystallizing a bit more clearly as a result of COVID and Brexit. Many of you will have seen in the news that there are labor shortages in the UK as a result of COVID and Brexit, as it is reported. And these are in sectors such as agriculture, lorry drivers that bring foods, fuel, etc., meat packing, etc. So there are several sectors that are being affected by the labor shortages. So the UK government has proposed and introduced a couple of proposals to address these shortages. First of all, since 2018, the UK has introduced a new restrictive visa scheme, a pilot visa scheme, following the Brexit referendum and in advance of Brexit. And the idea of this pilot visa scheme would be that seasonal workers would come and work in the UK for short periods of time and then leave the country. They wouldn't have the right to settlement or a right to citizenship. It's well known and that this kind of visas create vulnerability to exploitation. We know that very well when we have examples from across the world. The UK pilot that was introduced in 2018 was supposed to cover Brexit-related shortages, and initially it involved 2,500 workers, then 30,000 workers, and now it's been announced that there will be more of these short-term visas. It's not a surprise to anyone, I think, to any one of us that are interested in labor law and workers' rights issues, that there is already empirical evidence that shows that the workers under these pilot visas experience severe labor exploitation. There is empirical evidence in the UK by the organization Focus on Labor Exploitation that shows that the workers' recruitment, working conditions, and living conditions show elements of compulsion and duress, and that they cannot leave their employer. In any case, and despite this early empirical evidence, the government recently announced further plans to introduce more short-term visas to cover labor shortages. In the UK, we also know, and Adelle knows that very well also in relation to Canada, we have the UK overseas domestic worker visa, another restrictive visa regime that has been very much connected to instances of severe labor exploitation. So we know that restrictive visa schemes create serious vulnerability to exploitation, that workers are exploited. Despite that, what we see is that in order to cover labor shortages, the government is proposing and introducing even more of those. The second policy proposal of the government following Brexit in relation to Brexit and COVID-related shortages is that it has said that we will cover shortages here in the UK through prison labor. Working prisoners are excluded from a number of labor and social security rights in a lot of legal orders, including the UK. In the UK, they don't have a right to a minimum wage or other labor rights, and there are private employers who benefit from this situation. So it's another workforce, working prisoners, who are known to be exploited, to be compelled, coerced to work. And despite that, this is the kind of labor, the kind of workers that we will use to cover labor shortages in the UK in the meat packing industry, apparently, etc. These are just proposals, very vague for now. Third, and this is the final example I'll give of how laws create vulnerability to exploitation, is the UK welfare conditionality scheme, which means namely the scheme that makes welfare benefits conditional upon applying for work. The UK has one of the harshest welfare conditionality schemes in the world, and there is a lot of empirical evidence the last few years that what happens is those who are unemployed and poor become working and exploited poor, to put it very briefly. And so we see that there are people who are poor and unemployed, but are coerced in exploitative work. So in ways such as this, we see how the law creates further vulnerability to exploitation. For certain categories of workers who are particularly vulnerable and who cover labor needs in the UK labor market that we viewed, many of which we viewed as essential during the pandemic. So what I really liked when I saw the principle of commodification, the commodification in the manifesto is the importance, of course, of work, of a job guarantee, but also the idea that this should be decommodified and the connection to the dignity that work brings. It was great to see the reference to Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the right to work. And on this point, I simply wanted to highlight that when we refer to the right to work in the Universal Declaration, in the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, and in other legal documents, and when thinking about a job guarantee, it is crucial to think about working conditions as well. In the UK, we have a low unemployment, but we have a lot of jobs that are becoming all the more widespread and routine that are exploitative jobs, that are not, say, decent work, as the ILO puts it. When people are forced to work in conditions that are exploitative, with insecurity, in work poverty, then a job guarantee as alone is not sufficient. It may even be viewed as incompatible with the right to work. What we need is a right to a decent job, to a non-exploitative job, and this should be viewed as satisfying the requirements of the manifesto here, which is work that is connected to human dignity and other such principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for a lucid and in many ways sobering discussion of the ways in which labor market shortage in a market context is not actually leading to greater capacity for workers to claim decent work, but actually a series of policy measures that heighten precarity and commodification. So very helpful framing. Our third speaker is Karel Vanderpoorten. And before I turn over the microphone, let me just remind audience participants that you can post questions for our panelists in the Q&A section. Feel free to start now. I'm sure many thoughts have been already cultivated from the excellent presentations you've already heard. And then after the three speakers, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So Karel, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adele. Good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world. For me, it's afternoon, so I'm in Belgium, more specifically in the city of Ghent. I work for the European Commission, of course, Directorate General Industry, Internal Market, SMEs and Entrepreneurship, as you rightly introduced me. So this is, of course, very much related with the topic today, but maybe a little bit from the other side of the perspective, more the employer side. Nevertheless, I will not take the defense of the general employer today, but I want to show you, or I want to share with you the expertise that we have on a specific niche within a type of business called the social economy. The social economy is a different form of business in Belgium that, not in Belgium, in Europe, that wants to provide more sustainability in the business model, in the impact they create, that wants to have more democratic decision-making processes, or at least participatory decision-making processes within the business, and that wants to create also principles of solidarity, openness, and clarity towards the broader community outside the business. In this regard, the right to work is, of course, very important. And when I pick up where Virginia left, Article 15 of the Human Rights Declaration, for decent work, but also decent pay, the right to work for everybody, social economy is really a driver to offer job opportunities, for example, for those that are not supposed or that are thought to be not able to work. For example, people with a distance to the labor market, as we call them in European institutions, that might be people which are very low skilled, people with disabilities, a form of disability that might be, for example, very young people who are early school leavers, etc., that have a very difficult position on the labor market, and social economy is some kind of a specialized form to help those people to have a decent job, but also for decent pay. I think that is a very critical and important discussion. A second one is the democratic decision making that I already highlighted before within a social economy business, and how employees are engaged within the process. You have, for example, the type of a cooperative, a labor cooperative, where the owners are also the employees. So that is a very interesting principle in how, for example, somebody who's working in the business has also an equal voting right in managing the business. A third one that I would like to highlight today is also how, for example, employees are considered in the new type of, let's say, businesses. For example, the platform economy, where we see, of course, given the huge tech platforms that are around there, a huge disruption in our labor markets is present everywhere in the world. The Uberization of the labor market, we sometimes might call it, even though that is not a political correct terminology. But still, it's very interesting to focus on these type of new forms of work, because they also enable, and studies have shown that they enable, for example, vulnerable peoples to have a first and more decent income and jump to other positions in the labor market. So putting those type of labor in a very, let's say, dark corner of the labor market is, of course, not the best way to treat it. Of course, there are regulations needed, but what is more needed, and that's where I want to come, are alternatives to that. In Europe, we are experimenting a lot, or we see the social economy experimenting a lot with decentralized platforms, where also, again, for example, the employees or the users are also owning the platform and are not, let's say, abused by the platform for very low wages, bad insurance, bad labor conditions overall. So those type of alternative decentralized platforms are incredibly interesting within the social economy. These are three specific learnings, or let's say experiences that we see within the social economy that can really create spillovers to the wider economy, that can learn us how to respect better labor rights, how to give and provide equal access to the labor market for people that have more difficulties to join, and to also have a decent paycheck for those activities, and also to react in a more innovative but also sustainable manner to new technologies that are really disrupting the labor markets of today, and also put pressure on labor rights of employees. I think I will keep it there, but I'm happy to discuss further in this session. So far, the experience from the social economy in Europe, but I'm pretty sure, and I have seen many examples, that this is a very booming type of business model everywhere around the world. So I'm very happy to share more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karel, for so ably setting out, I'd say, an early teaser on what the social economy model looks like. And it recalls actually some of the insights from the keynote yesterday on democratizing work with Kwame Anthony Appiah, and his emphasis on the importance of experimentation in thinking our way through certainly democratizing the workplace, but also decommodifying the workplace, the place where working people spend at least a third of their waking lives. So thank you to each of the panelists for your analyses, and I think they offer us much opportunity for further discussion. Before I turn to the Q&A, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to offer a question that I hope will allow each of you to further your fascinating reflection. And it really turns on, so in some ways, and I'd say certainly Renata and Virginia, but also Karel, in your starting point, which is that alternatives, experimentation are not only necessary, but are in process, and the social economy is one of them. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the significance of the challenge that you are offering to prevailing existing regulatory frameworks. How much needs to change in order to be able to seize that beautiful contradiction and turn it into an actual reality? Are we in a context in which we can turn to the same regulatory policy tools that have put us in this circumstance of deep indeterminacy, which is what I take from Virginia's presentation? Is there the capacity to work within our existing frameworks, or does the manifesto compel us to step outside of them and to do something more fundamental? So I'm inclined to go in the same order that we started in, and feel free to offer whatever insights seem appropriate to you. So Renata.
Thank you, Professor Adelle. I think we need a big challenge to. We have a big challenge, and we need to do a big change in our structures of protection and of and even in the concept of work that is apt to be protected for state. Okay. When we talk about Brazil, and I like to complement some data about the situation in Brazil, we have big concerns about the informal work. Nowadays, we have 40% of our labor market in informality. So we have into this situation a lot of kinds of works that aren't even considered up to protection by our protective structure. And so we have in these groups of non-occupation, of informality, significant participation of women, of people of color, and that's why I brought here this concern about the criteria of protecting work, of considering work, and thinking of Brazilian situation. To share some data with you that can illustrate this situation. In Brazil, in 2019, we had a composition of people with no occupation that was in the order of 9.3% for white people and 13.6% for black and colored people. Among people with an occupation, the rate of informal jobs was 47.4% for black and colored people and 34.5% for white people. We have significantly distinct wages also between black and white people. And when we talk about poverty conditions in Brazil that increased significantly during the pandemic context, we are talking about a group formed by 38% of black women. And when we talk about extreme poverty in Brazil, we are talking about a group composed of 40% of black women. In both cases, the representation of the groups follows the same pattern. the participation of Black women, then of Black men, in second place white women, and then white men. And that's really associated to the choices that have been made about protecting labor, which labor is coming to be protected, and which structures of protection we inspired ourselves to reproduce in Brazil, and that are not able to deal with the reality of our kind of economy and social relations. So I think that's a big challenge that needs really radical transformation to respond at this expectative of the commodification. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, am I?
Shall I, Adelle? Shall I? I'm thinking about your question. What a difficult question. The manifesto. The manifesto wants to get us to think about big ideas, and this initiative, which is great. And I really liked the reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because they help us to think human rights law, the Universal Declaration, the ILO Declaration. They make us think about some first principles and find inspiration there. Obviously, these standards, rights, sometimes look much more like aspirations. And there is, of course, a lot to be done to achieve those. There are normative standards that can inform our thinking as we think what needs to change in these structures. In the case of the UK, the reason why I'm focusing on these concrete laws that make workers vulnerable is that I think that even through smaller change, if this is small, I don't see these changes happening in the UK, but improving visas, for example, and making them less restrictive. These are small changes there, which are not going to happen in the immediate future. I know in the UK, we can have significant improvement. So even through small legal change can make a difference. But of course, since a lot of the problems that are affect the labor market and workers' rights are deeper, structural change is essential, and this is harder to, there are different ways in which this can happen, and you need much more of you always need, obviously, collective organizations, trade unions, and other workers' rights organizations.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And nothing small about the changes you've articulated, indeed. And really important also that you both gestured at the differential impacts of these measures on communities within. And Renata, I think you underscored that is at some level part of the design, right? That we have to question whether our labor law frameworks were actually intended to treat all workers the same, or whether there's a paradigm that persists. Karel, and the social economy and our promise, our ray of hope here.
To be honest, I would like to address not specifically the role of social economy in this regard, because I was much triggered by this job guarantee that was taken into the manifesto, and that was already highlighted by both of you. To be honest, in the EU, there was already a sort of a job guarantee for needs, an attempt at least to put this forward from a policy perspective, and to make sure that every youngster leaving school or dropping out or had a degree would be supported in the way towards a job with a trajectory of 9 months and so on. And that was right after the financial and economic crisis 2007, 2008, because at that time youth unemployment was skyrocketing. So from a principle, this was of course a very interesting model, but it was successful in some countries, but also not in others. And that is just because the job market is not necessarily ready for that type of incentives. And also not ready to, let's say, absorb immediately, let's say, the influx of a whole let's say, group of people that are not having necessarily the right skills. So therefore, this mismatch is not solved. You see today that, for example, in several labor markets in the EU, there is a labor market shortage. So there are not enough people like in the UK, but it's definitely not in the UK, it's also in the EU, that many enterprises don't find people to do the jobs they have. Even the jobs are perfectly regulated, fair pay, high pay even, but they don't just find people with the right skills. And I think there is a very crucial point for what we call active labor market policies to create these matches way better, to also focus on people with a longer distance or a further distance from the labor market and support those in accessing those jobs, but also for employers to make those job requirements more fitted to those vulnerable people. Their active labor market policy can play a great role, and we have some very good practices everywhere in Europe, but this is really work in progress, and it requires a lot of support, intermediary support from public employment services, for example, but also more private intermediaries that can support this, that can answer those mismatches on the labor market. So starting from the perspective of a job guarantee all the way to the practice and realizing that for all type of employees, for people who are vulnerable, but also regular employees that, for example, will lose their job because of the Green Deal. I don't say there is a direct effect of the Green Deal on losing jobs, but at least an indirect effect, because we should be honest about it. Coal mines, they will close anyhow. Is it not tomorrow? It will be in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. So there is an end phase that started for several industries in Europe, where many employees will come on the labor market, which are not necessarily skilled appropriately to find immediately a new job. So therefore, this upskilling and reskilling strategies, active labor market policies will be more crucial than ever to make also this green transition just, and to make sure that employees, people who are already in a decent job today with a decent pay, with decent rights, will not fall in this trap. And that is really the challenge for the future, together with overheating labor markets, for example, as we see them today. And a job guarantee is a principle that can have a big effect on those type of policies. So we should be aware. We should be aware of that. Also, the mobility of employees, which is of course in the single market something that is very present and is also very precious, but also can put a lot of pressure on labor markets. For example, as we see in the UK, that the UK is still investing today in certain visa, even if they don't respect the labor rights, as Virginia told. But instead, people might ask, okay, we should also invest in our own unemployed, and why our own unemployed are not finding the way to those jobs, and why is there a mismatch in the labor market at the local level as well. So very complex in terms of transferring this into policies. I have seen for my relatively young career many different exercises, very successful but also really miserable examples where support measures were just not used in the right manner by very local authorities, because they just have not the capacity to do so. So this is a bit my experience in terms of labor market policy, active labor market policy, versus principles like the job guarantee. It has nothing to do with social economy as such, but social economy, and that is where I would like to end, is one of the answers to the questions that I just raised. which intermediaries can facilitate these mismatches, for example, by helping people to find a job, but also by helping, for example, regular enterprises which are not belonging to the social economy to employ people with disabilities, to employ people with a distance to the labor market, and to make sure that they have a fair position and that they have also a fair pay in those job opportunities. So that is where I would like to end a bit broader policy perspective here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for taking that invitation to speak to the broader policy, because one takeaway from your reflections, Karel, is that there isn't one silver bullet, so to speak, that there's a comprehensive mix of strategies that need to be thought through if one is going to respond to the intensity of the need. If I may, that some strategies might actually undermine rather than strengthen the broader objective of decent work, of decommodification. So, so much of the discussion today has been around appropriately, carefully identifying the diagnosis in order to be able to think about what needs to be applied, and that has to be contextualized. We need a sense of the political economy of each of the places in which these measures are being thought through. This leads me to one of the questions in the chat, because part of the contextualization is also thinking about the way in which policies in one place might have spillover effects or impacts on other parts of the world, other regions. Migration has been invoked in several of the presentations. The free market internally, and considerations of who's unemployed one keeps into account. Differential impacts. Renata has referred to colonization, slavery, in relation to much of how we think about decommodification. And Adelle Queiroz has both complimented the panel for the quality of the discussion and urged you to think about conditions of workers in particular in the Global South, and whether you can see any positive or subversive aspects of developments that might encourage a form of international solidarity as we think through the decommodification principle. Can you actually talk about decommodification if you're not taking into account a Global South perspective, and a perspective that engages international solidarity, right? And of course, images of boats off the Mediterranean cannot fail to come to mind, and of course, there are many other images. So, who might like to address this comment or question? I think we have a bit of time for everyone if you so wish. So Renata, I see you.
Well, I can make a fast point. We discussed on the launch of the Brazilian book about the manifesto in Brazil, that the phenomenon of Uberization appears in Europe as a big news, no? But in fact, for us in Brazil, it's very similar, like a appropriation by capitalist economy of our well-known ways of work that are reminiscent of slavery. So Black people carrying food at their bags to distribute food or other commodities in the city is something very old, very typical, and very precarious in our experience. So when we see a big company appropriating this way of working that is banalized in our reality, we see that maybe South have something to teach to the North economies, so that we are our ways of working are contaminating the North in some way. So this articulation by the comprehension of the reality of other countries and the sharing of the ways of resistance may be an important way in this moment. That's it.
Thank you. Other panelists want to address this question? Virginia?
In the UK, there is Adele, you may know it as well as I do, or better. In the UK, there is, in relation to migration, I'm thinking, as I'm based here in the UK, there is a strong movement for the rights of domestic workers and migrant workers. At this domestic workers who are migrant workers and other migrant generally, and other migrant workers as well. And there is civil society, powerful support by civil society. The government, on the other hand, doesn't seem to, so doesn't listen. But there certainly is a movement and interest in the rights of migrant workers, and in that sense there is expression of solidarity towards migrant workers.
Yes, go ahead.
I would like to refer actually to my second point of my intervention, that from a perspective of the social economy, actually those trends enabled a whole new economy. Maybe an economy that is not yet very visible everywhere in Europe, but the first signs for us are really promising. I will go back to the Uber-alike platforms, but maybe another which is called the delivery services sector. We all know the big platforms. I don't need to repeat them, but in France, for example, there is a very strong business model coming up, which is led by a firm, and I can of course drop the name Cope Cycle. It's a France level cooperative, and what they do is they provide software to set up a delivery system at the local level. And they promote local riders cooperatives, so the riders with the bikes who bring the meal to you, so that they can set up their own cooperative in competition with the existing big ones. So it's a decentralized technology model where they offer software to enable those local businesses to compete with the existing very easygoing platforms, because if you have the regular ones, they are working excellent, and they try to put another alternative next to that. And we see that this has a very big success. We have also similar actions, for example, in the foods, circuits, etc. And of course, this is about the technology. What I mean by the technology is creates also a new market, but this new market enables directly, of course, better labor rights, because the core principle of those enterprises are, of course, the cooperative movement and the cooperative values, which means that every rider is de facto an owner of the business and has equal rights within the business, regardless of his shares. So that is for me a very interesting trend. If I come back to the angle of social economy, which we see popping up everywhere in Europe, the same for taxi drivers, the same for food delivery, the same for even tourism sectors with alternatives for short rentals, etc., etc. So those type of phenomena, which are also, and I have seen examples in the US, in Canada, and even North Korea, everywhere around the world, are popping up more and can really really leverage, due to this shared, let's say, technology provision, can really leverage a new market driven by social economy actors. And that is, of course, very much in our personal interest, or in the Commission's interest, at least in my department, to push for those models which are indirectly promoting better labor rights and also better conditions for employees in our labor markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karel, and thank you all. This has been a fascinating panel. If I have one frustration, it's that we have only really just been able to scratch the surface of the very rich presentations you each have offered to us, but that's the blessing in many ways of a global forum of this initiative. We'll have opportunities to continue these exchanges through different panels and plenaries. So thank you for your contributions to this. Thank you to each of the attendees for your engagement, for your presence in this session, for the lovely comments that are in the chat. Participants, panelists, I hope you'll have a chance to read them. And I'd like to take a moment not only to thank the organizers for this remarkable event, but also the technical moderator for our session, Libby Quinn. Thank you very much for your guidance today. So just a round of virtual applause, and look forward to further such conversations on decommodification.